Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro Podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Jacob Shapiro. I am rejoined on the podcast by our favorite weather guru. He probably will hate being called a guru, but that's okay. I can call him that. It's Daryl Ritchison. He is the director of the North Dakota Agricultural Weather Network and also the North Dakota State climatologist. Thank you, Daryl, for coming on. A lovely apolitical talk about the weather here, putting aside all of politics for a second. I mean, obviously, we try to be objective on this podcast at all times, but really hard to make the weather political. So thank you, Daryl, for coming on and talking about it. If you want to talk about anything you heard on this podcast or about speaking events, anything else, I have more email addresses than I can count right now. So jacob@jacobshapiro.com, probably your best bet for now. Otherwise, take care of the people that you love. Cheers and see you out there. All right, our favorite weather guru is back on the podcast, and I'm thankful for him because he was patient with me because I was a few minutes late as well. Daryl, it's really good to see you. How's it going?
Oh, it's going great, and it's really nice to be on once again. It's been a while.
It's been a while, and honestly, I have been, we're recording on Tuesday, January 28th. We'll probably get this out at the beginning of next week. As you can hear from my voice, which is fading and getting tinnier by the moment, I have been on calls all today about Chinese artificial intelligence and U.S.-Colombia relations and U.S. tariffs on Taiwan. I am really happy to sink into a conversation about something as apolitical as the weather. This is going to be relaxing to me, so I hope it's relaxing to the listeners too. Daryl, the first question I wanted to ask you, oftentimes when we're talking, you do a good job of sobering me up and saying, hey, like, this thing may seem crazy, but there's a lot of historical context for this. This has happened before. Like, don't worry about this. We got a foot of snow in New Orleans last week. Does that fall in the unprecedented category? Because I was sitting here watching the snowfall and watching my flights get canceled, and I was wondering, what would Daryl say? Would Daryl say that this is all part of some normal trend in general, and this happens every once in a while, or would this shock him to his core?
Nothing in weather shocks me. Number one, it has happened before, as you likely know from your local media. It's told you about the 1890s event. Some things only happen once every 100 years. Some things only happen every 500 years. I don't necessarily find them unprecedented. You could use the term rare is what I usually like to describe them, but it gives people along the Gulf Coast something to tell their grandchildren about, that the big snowstorm of 2025.
It was. So I grew up in rural Georgia, which it's more often to have winter weather up there. But I still remember the blizzard of 1993. I remember sitting in the living room and we were building snowmen and all the power went out and things like that. So maybe that'll be something that people remember. But I mean, the pictures of the snow, falling a foot deep right up to the beach, like on the sand. I mean, just incredibly wild. Are there any similarities to what happened in the 1890s to now? Like, are there similar patterns or similar things that are happening, or both just sort of freak occurrences?
I think, I don't like to use the term freak, but it was a very similar pattern. I love history, and weather history is usually referenced as climatology, of course, but in many ways, to me, there's a historical aspect of weather that's not so much climatology as it is the stories, how humans dealt with such differing things at different times through history. So I remember reading about that snow event in the 1890s. I think it was 1895, if I remember correctly. And then it happened again. And so when you understand the past, and all these weather events, it's always interesting when they happen, because I'll be the first one to say, oh, I will never probably see that happen. Was that one storm. And then when you do get to see it, it's fascinating. It's like the 1993 storm that you mentioned. I was in my TV days going, this could be a historical event. It just looks like it's going to be terrible. It probably won't be as bad as it sounds, but it really looks pretty bad. And it was everything you could have ever imagined, the 93 storm. And then some. You couldn't really overhype that one. And in some ways, this event, because where it happened, it was really hard to overhype it too. It's very unusual. And the odds favor it might not happen again until the 2100s sometime.
Probably not. And this is one case where the forecasts were calling for 4 to 8 inches. And I was like, I just have a hard time believing there's going to be 4 to 8 inches. And then it started falling and I was like, this is going to be more than 4 to 8 inches. Like, I lived in upstate New York for 4 years. I've been around snow. Like, this is the real deal. So yeah, just kind of crazy.
I would have been conservative and said 4 to 8 too, although a lot of computer guidance was indicating the foot that you ended up with But do you really believe that when it hasn't happened in 125 years? But it did.
Well, and I don't know if you saw, like, I don't even think technically the city has official records. Like, the 1895 storm, they don't have the official records from it from the city. So they're just guessing,
Yes,
to your
that's
point,
true.
based on the reports and stories around the time, like how much it was. So for all we know, it was like 6 inches, but at the time they thought it was the
Yeah,
biggest
you're
thing that
right
ever
about
happened. I
that.
don't
They
know.
really didn't, and that's true with a lot of those old records.
Yeah. All right. Well, does the snowstorm tell us anything more broadly about what's happening with weather in the entire world, or was it really just an isolated circumstance here in the Gulf?
I would say that it tells you some things because it happened with scenarios that have happened in the past. And I as if anyone's listened to previous when I've been on your podcast or any of my public talks, I oftentimes use analogs, which is similar events in the past, and those scenarios ended up doing this. Why would not those similar scenarios end up being here this year? And some of the past snow events that have been in the deep south in the past, or even more recently, but just then wasn't this bad, tended to occur in winters with the upper level wind flow being similar that led to dry conditions in the United States that upcoming summer. Even before the storm, I've been forecasting 2025. Just there's a lot of reasons to believe it will be dry in the core of the United States, say between the Rockies and the Appalachians in the growing season in 2025. And when something like this happened, and when the very few times it's happened in the past led to that same scenario, it just, in a way, increases my confidence.
Hmm. What is it, dry in the core of the country? Does it, selfishly, does it mean also a weaker hurricane season? I know that we're in a very weak La Nina, although maybe it's going to be out of the door by the summer. But I know you also hate it when anybody invokes La Nina. So why don't I get you started now and you can get on your hobby horse?
Hey, I La Nina has impacts. El Nino has impacts. It's the thing that always drives me crazy is it's not the only impact. And truth be told, we're still not technically in a La Nina. You know, there's
Oh,
a
I thought we were.
definition for it, which I think meteorologists in any discipline you're in will come up with definitions to kind of keep everyone on the straight and narrow. But by definition, it's a La Nina is 3 consecutive months with the average temperature in the central Pacific at a half a degree Celsius. You know, if you're a Fahrenheit dude, just think 1 degree Fahrenheit or colder. Well, December did finish with temperatures below that threshold, but we have to get through January and February for it to be technically a La Nina. And I think that's going to happen. But for all practical purposes, we can call it a La Nina. And if you're curious, El Nino is the exact opposite. It's a half a degree Celsius or warmer for a full 3 straight months, which easily happened a year ago. So this is La Nina. It will very likely fade this spring. And the odds favor this upcoming summer being in neutral territory, neither a La Nina or an El Nino. And I bet we sit in neutral territory for a long time, is my strong suspicion. So then we're looking at other things. One of the things would be the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is a larger scale El Nino, La Nina in some ways, if you want to look at it. And also the Atlantic Ocean, which has been warm for 30 years and it's in its positive phase. You know, how long is that going to last? I usually tell people I think it's going to turn negative in the 2030s, which will change, especially European weather that could last in the 2030s, 2040s. You know, it could be 20, 25 years of changes for them, but it does have some impacts in North America as well.
Hmm. Does the degree of the La Nina or the El Nino correspond directly to its impacts? Like, if the temperature is off higher or lower, does that mean that the impacts in, say, South America are going to be greater or weaker?
Yes. Matter of fact, in my talks in the last few months, and I was in Florida a couple of weeks ago before it snowed.
Of
But I
course.
was on frost advisories when I was there. Just classic when I'm in Florida, it's always cold. But when I was there, I was talking to the National Potato Expo, so the National Potato Council, the big potato meeting every year. This year was in Orlando. You know, went through, and because it was a newer audience, most of these people have never heard me speak before. I wanted to really show them that okay, you hear the word La Nina, and you hear the word La Nina, and every time even NOAA for good or bad, does this. Well, here's the forecast. La Nina equals this. And I always go, hey, there's more involved, I know, as everyone knows, than just La Nina. But I go, they don't seem to a lot of times give you the strength and those correlations. And so I went through the United States map and go, okay, with weak La Ninas, this is what happens. With stronger La Ninas, notice it's not the same. And so you get different results based on not only the temperatures, but really how kind of widespread that La Nina, where's that cold water pool, where is it situated? If it's situated closer to South America, this tends to happen. If it's situated more in the Central Pacific, Y instead of X may happen. And so weak La Ninas oftentimes don't follow the trend that a traditional La Nina would. For example, not to bring back your snow, but a La Nina, what does a La Nina bring in the southern part of the United States in the winter? Warm and dry. It has been nothing but that this year. For me, it brings cold and wet. It hasn't been that way. But if you go back in history and look at weak La Ninas, this winter has fit that scenario very well.
And so what does the weak La Nina into neutral mean for your U.S. forecast then? So you already sort of alluded to a drier U.S. forecast for the core of the country, but overall, what are you thinking going into the summer and for the rest of the
Well,
year?
if in the last 40 years, 45 years, if you go back to just 1980 to now, where our data is better, it's higher resolution data that we have. There's really been about 9 of these scenarios, weak La Ninas in that time frame. And they've all faded in the summer, so they turned into more neutral. But then you have to go, okay, we also have this negative Pacific Decadal Oscillation. Not only is it
Mhm.
negative, it's kind of fairly strongly negative. So you throw that scenario in, really a very high percentage of those, like 7 of the 9, you'll see, say, the traditional corn and soybean belts. So that'd be really areas, running southern Minnesota, eastern Nebraska, the I states, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana. They had tended to have, and that's a very high percentage, 7 of 9, a drier than average summer. And so because the PDO is negative and we're coming off a cooling of the Pacific, they didn't necessarily turn out to be like a hot, dry summer, say like 2021 or 2012, which a lot of people will remember, or if you're a little older, 1988, but they were dry with temperatures just, maybe not way above average, but just a little bit, which helps in many ways because every degree is more evaporation, more stress on the crops. But those years did end up being noticeably drier than average. So after a good cropping year of 2024, I would say there's reasons to believe that yields will be down in 2025, especially through the I states and including, say, parts of Wisconsin and as well as southern Minnesota off into eastern portions of Nebraska, say.
How about for our friends along the Colorado River? It was actually a pretty wet sort of 12 months along the Colorado River and in some of these places in California. Hard to think about that now with all the devastation that's happened in Los Angeles and in Southern California. But what do you see there in this
Well,
context?
if you look at my analogs, that area goes through the spring and then has a pretty good monsoon season that would favor at least average, if not a little bit above average. Because what will happen, if you can imagine the upper level wind flow, is, troughs or dips, ridges, move up, bring warm air, towards the poles. So we would have a trough kind of in the Pacific Northwest, a ridge of high pressure between, say, the Rockies and the Appalachians, and then a trough, especially over New England. That type of pattern would favor bringing in Gulf of California, Pacific, and even Gulf of Mexico, or no, Gulf of America moisture into the Southwest and give them at least a reasonably decent um, say monsoon season in the desert Southwest. And so in the Colorado Basin. But although, say, Southern California has been very dry this winter, not unusual for La Ninas, but a lot of times these weak La Ninas, as you get into spring, they will have a couple of storms come through. And, they just had one recently that brought some rain. Of course, that will bring devastating mud flows and have negative consequences where the fires were. but bring some moisture that they need at the same time. So again, my analog package, that's what it suggests in those years. And of course, you can't really have the entirety of the lower 48 all dry or all wet. It's this trough and ridge system. And if you're going to get the center dry, usually the West Coast and the East Coast is a little bit more favorable for precipitation.
All right, deep breath. I've procrastinated asking for long enough. How's my Atlantic hurricane season looking?
Boy, as long as the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, now we're talking the Atlantic Ocean, is in its warm phase. William Gray, the originator, he passed away several years ago of Atlantic hurricane forecasting back. He's the one in the 1990s when the AMO, and again, that's the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, tends to last 30, 40 years in these phases through time. That whole, we're going to have this uptick in Atlantic hurricanes because of this. He wasn't drawn. We had the uptick. And so in turn, the Gulf is warmer than average. The Atlantic's warmer than average. The fading La Nina helps a little bit because then we might be able to increase shear, and that's upper level winds being stronger that may suppress them. But, if I lived where you did in the Gulf Coast or the East Coast, as long as the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, and these are warmer than average, it would always put up at least one antenna that is just going to be keep an eye on. And the thing is, even when the hurricane season is weak, we all learned with Andrew in 92, there's really one storm that whole summer, and it was, Andrew. It only takes one. But again, there's just favorability. I think the La Nina fading helps a little bit, but that doesn't mean that nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, one storm in the wrong place can do a lot of damage, but I'd prefer if Mother Nature had fewer shots on goal, if you will.
Yeah, this season might have one or two fewer shots on goal, but I think it's going to take till the 2030s to really settle down the Atlantic Ocean, because really globally, hurricane numbers are down. The ACE, the accumulated cyclone energy that you measure, all the energy from hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones, depending on where you're on the planet, is trending downwards. So the Pacific and Indian Ocean basins have actually been a little quieter in recent years, say in the last decade, but the Atlantic has been full throttle. Let's be honest here. Eventually that will probably flip-flop where the Atlantic starts settling down, but then the other basins probably will flare back up. But I still think we're at least 3 to 5 years away from that transition to occur.
All right, well, let me push on that a little bit. So how long do I have to put up with this Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation? Like, you think it's on its way out in 3 to 5 years, 10 to 15? Too hard to say?
I've been saying the 2030s for probably 20 years. Okay. And I stick to it because that's just following the trends through history, because you can use proxy data for it, but you can also just use the Atlantic Ocean in particular, of course, has been widely used since 1492. So you do get a lot of records, even though they're proxy data and they're not, maybe official and such, that the cyclic pattern that you get. So I would stick to that I think you have a few more years before it's going to switch over. And if history is our guide, it may actually flip-flop pretty quickly.
All right. Well, from your lips to God's ears. I want to go back to something you said earlier, which was you said we had a pretty strongly negative Pacific Decadal oscillation. Can you tell me, you've already sort of alluded to it, but can you tell me in plain English what that is, and then what that means, not just for the United States, but from a global perspective? Like, I understand sort of what La Nina is supposed to translate into, but what does a strongly negatively correlated Pacific Decadal, did I say it right? Pacific Decadal oscillation?
Yeah, it's really weird because, they couldn't name them the same, but it's the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And then in the Atlantic Ocean, it's the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. So it's the AMO and the Atlantic PDO in the Pacific. So really, this in many ways came about because of salmon fishing. They would go, wow, salmon fishery, say in the Pacific Northwest of the United States and then Canada up through Alaska, that, salmon fishing would be really good numbers, good catches, life was good. And then all of a sudden for like 10, 12 years, it just was awful. Where did all the salmon go? What's going on? Well, it was the ocean temperatures. And so what would happen and what happens is the west coast of the United States up into Canada, the ocean temperatures fall, so become colder, and that's the cool phase or the negative phase. At the same time, the Northwest Pacific, say northeast of Japan, between Japan and the Aleutian Islands, that area will actually warm up. And then when you flip flop the positive, then the Northwest Pacific turns colder than average, but the west coast of the United States turn warmer. And generally speaking, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation has been negative for the last 15 years. That colder air will have a tendency to form ridges of high pressure a lot of times over the over the Rocky Mountains, which in turns brings a northwest. The upper level winds come from the northwest over, say, the central part of the United States, and northwest flow. You can't tap into the Gulf of Mexico moisture as much, and it tends to be dry. So I like to refer to the negative PDO as a dry flavor. Just you tend, not every year, but if you look at all the records, you will get to the point where, probably when the PDO is negative, a lot of folks will only be wet maybe 1 out of 3 years, or average or below the other years. And if you think about it, since say 2020, a lot of the central part of the United States, again, between the two mountain ranges, have been a little on the dry side. There's been spots that have been wet, no doubt, but the overall trend has been, a dry flavor. Say where I am in Fargo, North Dakota, talking, we've had 5 years in a row of below average precipitation. And all 5 years, the PDO has been negative. Last time we really had a wet year was a year where the PDO happened to switch positive instead of negative. I don't find that to be a coincidence.
What does a negative PDO mean for Asian countries, if anything? Does it affect them in the same way that it affects the United
It
States?
does, in the sense of negative PDO tends to translate into more La Niñas. And La
Hmm.
Niñas, because the waters are a little bit cooler, La Niñas tend to be the wet years and the good crop years in Australia. For example, their forecast wheat production here as they're harvesting wheat is up. I think the last I'd read, maybe as much as 25%. Well, guess what? Last year was El Nino, bad. This year, La Nina, good. No surprise on that.
Yeah.
Southeast Asia tends to do that, but it does tend to also suppress a little bit the number of typhoons. And you've noticed Asia hasn't had a lot of typhoons in the last several years. Again, it only takes one, and they've had a couple bad ones, but generally speaking, there's not been a lot of them. So that's how the Pacific Ocean influences both sides. It's by far the largest basin. The Pacific Ocean is 38% of the planet, if I recall correctly. So it does have impacts. The one place the impacts are not really there would be, say, Europe, and certainly some parts of Africa as well. But Asia, East
Okay.
Asia for sure, North and South America for sure.
At least anecdotally, there have been reports out of Argentina about concerns about dryness and concerns about the early crop in Argentina and places in Brazil. Obviously, they're probably still, PTSD from the triple dip La Nina that caused such damage there in general. Do you think that it's more about that PTSD, or are you showing that this weak La Nina maybe is going to follow through for our friends down in Argentina and in Brazil?
Well, there's two certainties in my world when there's La Ninas. And there's no such thing as 100% in my business, and as yours. um, but,
Less and
but
less.
if there's anything that I would actually put a few dollars on the table for, it's Argentina being dry with a La Nina of any flavor, weak, moderate, strong, and Australia having a good year and getting some moisture with La Ninas too. Recently, you get north of that little dry area, it's been phenomenally wet. So, Mato Grosso starting to harvest their soybeans way behind, one of the slowest harvests they've had so far. And they're
Hmm.
always the first ones to go. And even some areas that were a little dry for a while has been getting some rain, which I think is going to continue through the first half of February. But then there's a sharp boundary, which you described, where it looks like it's going to stay dry, and probably not every single spot in Argentina. It's a huge growing area, but generally speaking, average, or certainly many areas below average the rest of their cropping year, as they get into their harvest and stuff, is probably going to continue. And this is the time of year in Argentina. Of course, there, depends on when they planted them, but flowering, it's a more critical time as you move south into those areas. So I would anticipate some droppage of yield potential in Argentina. Would not surprise me at all.
Hmm. This is a totally separate and random question aside. Is there a place where you can actually bet on weather? I feel like you can bet on everything else in the world right now. Like, is there a weather exchange where you can bet on dryness in Argentina or number of storms or things
It's
like
called the
that?
markets.
Are there markets? Like, well, no. Besides the markets, I mean,
No, I
like
made that
somebody.
as a joke because that's really
Oh,
like a
okay, I'm
weather
sorry, I missed it.
market, because every time, something happens, prices change. But I don't know anymore. It's not in an area I watch, but I know in the past you could do betting in Las Vegas on weather. But I don't know if you still can
Around
any
this stuff.
place. But I always
Well, because you
jokingly
had to
say it's
predict
the
it with the
markets.
election results, and I had somebody on X who was showing me like, "Oh, what odds on what the next pandemic disease is gonna be really grim." So we should get all the weather guys together and see if you guys are on an exchange, if you can call the shots better than the rest of the gamblers. Well, let's get to maybe the most geopolitical weather question that I can ask you. What's the winter gonna be like in Europe, and especially in Eastern Europe? Are we looking at a colder winter? Is Vladimir Putin's hopes for a cold winter to hurt Europe going to be thwarted yet again? What are we seeing there?
All indications are that as they finish the rest of their winter, it's going to be, I think, worst case scenario is average, and it still looks pretty warm to me moving forward in time. I do know the latest long range, both the European model and the Americans run a couple times a week, guidance out to 45 days, month and a half. Both of them are indicating that 5-day stretch to be generally not every single day, but overall the average being above average. And once you get beyond that, we're almost, into mid March later. It only can get so cold that time of year. So I think Mr. Putin's probably going to be disappointed. When the AMO switches in the 30s, then it's going to be the opposite. More cold winters or average or below. But in the last 20, this whole decade, the whole century, I should say, there's been very few really cold European winters. But that's pretty typical when the AMO is positive. All that warm water, you're 2 or 3 degrees Celsius above average water surrounding you to the west, northwest of Europe. It's just going to be, generally gives you an extra couple degrees Celsius. And that is a lot less heat that you need to warm those houses up.
Too bad he didn't consult his weather Rasputin. Is there at least an unintended positive of better growing temperatures and conditions in the Black Sea Basin and for Russia itself? Is that the flip side of the warmer temperatures, or no relief
No,
there?
it's been bad because it's been dry with the warm weather. I've read this from multiple sources that the winter wheat grown as it went into winter in some of the worst conditions ever, especially in Russia more than the Ukraine area. Russia does both ways, but and this warm, dry weather, and then if it warms up too much, the wheat will try to head too early, which in turn
Mhm.
could be damaged if they get a late season cold snap, which oftentimes happens. It happens in North America. It happens for them too. You have warm for a couple of months. It always comes back to haunt you then in the spring. You might as well have cold when you want it in the winter time. So I think Russia is not going to have a great winter wheat crop. We'll see what spring wheat does for that season coming up. But the winter wheat really, from multiple sources and just looking at the weather and a few people in that area that I follow on X, it just looks bad. And warm winters with the winter wheat when it comes into the season bad, um, just not a net positive on all of that. So in turn, they might end their record-breaking exporting seasons for Russia, which will
Hmm.
hurt Mr. Putin on all of that. So that's the net negative of the warm winter in Europe, translating into not the best winter wheat crop. But again, Russia grows quite a bit of spring wheat too. So there's always that hope coming forward. But it looks like their winter wheat's going to be pretty poor.
Sounds like you're giving a rather pessimistic forecast for most of the growing regions of the world. I mean, it sounds like Australia gets a reprieve, but am I right in that you're basically saying that for the next couple of months, not going to be ideal for just about any portion of the world?
Yeah, Australia's looking good. South America was looking great. And I know no one has to believe me when I say this stuff, but it's hard not to say it. But for the last month, I've been saying, oh, South America looks great. And I go, wait till harvest season, wait till harvest season. And last week, someone in the markets was speaking after I was speaking and said, geez, Daryl, I thought you were just saying that. And I go, no, I wasn't just saying that. She goes, well, yeah, look all this bad stuff that's happening. So yeah, and then we'll have to see in the United States. I bet we get off to a good start this spring, but hopefully it's not too dry. But I think there's reasons to believe the markets will be moving a little bit more as we go through the next couple of months because the weather's not necessarily behaving. But in my business, and I've been saying this for a long time, we've had a series of some really good growing weather around the world. You just can't, you don't need to be a meteorologist to know that that just not the way the weather works. You're going to eventually run into a tough year here or there. That's just the part of growing crops. And so it looks bad right now, but doesn't mean it's, going to continue for 2 or 3 seasons in a row. But in the short term, like you said, yeah, there's a lot of negatives out there.
Okay. So we hit La Nina, we hit the Atlantic multi-decadal, we hit the Pacific decadal. What are some other ones that we should have in our minds? Like if we're going to be overachievers here and say, all right, we're not going to stop at La Nina and we're not going to stop at the decadal ones. Like what are some other major forces that people should be keeping in mind when they're trying to place the weather for the year in context?
Oh, perhaps the Indian Ocean dipole would be one that most people have never heard of. It's the IOD. Um, right now, it's in its negative phase. And when it's in its negative phase, think of it as a big giant circulation pattern. And nobody can see me do this, but I'll do it for you. It's like a big giant circle. You have part of it going up, and upward motion in the atmosphere is clouds, precipitation. Okay. Downward sinking motion coming down on the other side of this dipole is warm, dry weather. And so when the Indian Ocean, this dipole is negative, that upward happens to be Australia. So Australia has La Nina helping them, plus the IOD. But these are two positive things for Australia going on right now. And then so all of Indonesia, all the islands through their far southeastern sections of Asia would bring a little bit of moisture, but it's their dry season, of course, with their monsoon. But as you go westward into, say, Pakistan, eastern parts of Africa and stuff, that would be hot, dry weather. Would that carry forward and impact the upcoming monsoon season that's coming here in the next few months? Will it delay the monsoon season in India? If it sticks to what it's doing right now, it probably would. And I don't have to tell anyone from this podcast how much dependent, India is on the monsoon season.
Well, and particularly bad timing, especially as the Indian government seems like it's starting to gear up for agricultural reforms 2.0. It lost the first fight with the farmers, but now it seems to be gearing up for 2.0. Already gotten reports of tractor protests starting to go up again. Man, if you added a significant delay to the monsoon season, there things could get pretty dicey in Indian
Right.
agriculture
And so
pretty
I'm not
quickly. No?
saying there's going to be a delay, but you asked me what else to watch out for. That's one I would watch out for because what it's situating right now would lead you to believe there might be a delay. And so the geopolitics involved plus that delay could be something very newsworthy as we go through the next few months. So it's something to watch.
Yeah. Anything else besides the Indian dipole, or is that the last one on your bingo card for
I
now?
don't know if I can give all of your people listening any more acronyms. We went through, I could, the El Nino, La Nina, that oscillation is called ENSO, ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation. So I gave you then, so there's ENSO, the AMO, the PDO. I gave you the IOD. Do you want me to talk about the Madden-Julian oscillation, which is a good forecasting tool for the next 4 to 6 weeks? So I'm just throwing all these 3-letter things at people.
Well, how about this? How about I'll get you out of here on this question. I know it's gonna make you want to tear your hair out. But what is and it's okay. We won't like hold you to it. But what is your most high conviction out there prediction for the year ahead?
The thing I'm probably the most confident in is the dry forecast in the United States. And,
And that's specifically in the core, in the
a
Midwest.
year ago in my 23-24 talks, a La Nina is coming in agricultural circles, especially in the United States. A La Nina forecast, everyone thinks drought, mainly because of what happened in the late 80s. And that's still, and I go, no, there's more to it than that. So a year ago, when people asked me, wow, we're going to have this big drought in the United States in 24 because this La Nina is coming. And I go, I really don't think so. There's not going to be a La Nina. It's going to take forever to form and all of that. But I go, I'll give you a drought in 2025, but I'm not going to give you a drought in 2024. Well, so far that worked out. And I probably just jinxed myself, but there's a lot of reasons. I mean, if you do that, AMO all by itself has a dry flavor in the core of the United States, the key, main growing areas. The PDO in the summertime when it's negative. So a positive AMO tends, just that alone, if you just plot that, dry in the center part of the United States. If you just plot the PDO all by itself, years with the PDO, especially when it's strongly negative, it tended to be dry. Okay. Summers after a weak La Nina, a high percentage of those are dry. And there's a couple of other things out there that also, so there's a lot of these things add up that's just say there's a strong indication that it'll be dry. The weather does what it does. It snows in New Orleans a foot once every 100 years. So there's no guarantees in the business. I'm just here saying that in the United States, there's a lot of indicators pointing towards a drier than average summer in 2025. And that's why that area I probably around the world right now have the most confidence in that
Hmm.
forecast.
Do you, do you feel like markets have priced that in, or do you feel like you're pushing against the grain here? If
Well,
you'll
the
forgive the
markets have been
terrible
really
pun, I guess.
slow, but I've been getting a lot of phone calls in the last week going, hey, Daryl, I heard so and so talk say it was going to be dry this summer. Oh, I heard so and so talk. They're saying a dry summer. And every time someone calls me about that, I will go, oh, I see they're copying my forecast. That makes me feel better. It's just a joke. I don't really want, to say anything about this other ag forecaster, in that sense of the word. But I'm not the only one that's saying it. And so I'll be curious. The thing is, it's going to be if we get out and plant in the spring, there is moisture there that gets crop going. And so that's a positive. And if we can get the crop going, then everyone's going to go, oh, this many acres of soybeans, this many acres of corn. It's not going to really affect the markets all that much. It's really going to take, oh my goodness, we've gone like 5 weeks now without very many thunderstorms, and there's a lot of stress on the crop. So it's one of the things to me, the markets may not, if my forecast is right, there might not be very many changes in the market until the middle of the summer when there's really more evidence of that. And also, Brazil raises so much, but the rain that's occurring in Mato Grosso right now is really threatening them getting their safrinha corn crop, that second corn crop in, because it has to get in time before their dry season comes, which would lower those yields as well. And they're putting in some very wet soybeans into their bins right now because of the rain for that first harvest. So, it depends, how your darts are going to land and what you're wanting to do. But, if you look at the markets, not much is happening right now. I understand why. They need more evidence.
Yeah, although if what you just talked about with Brazil comes to fruition, that'll have some major implications on U.S.-China relations, especially as the Trump administration goes in there and starts talking about Chinese purchases of soybeans and corn, and from where, because it hasn't been from the U.S. farmer, at least when it comes to soybeans recently.
Right, and that's as you know better than me, predicting Trump is makes weather forecasting seem easy. So it's
Well, you've got the Trumpian multi-decadal oscillation combined with, I don't know, I'd have to come up with
no, you
some
should
stuff here.
coin that one. I like that personally.
Yeah, I will. It's warm. It's warm in the Gulf. It's warm in the Gulf. Ergo, Trump will decide tariffs on Colombia today. That's about as good as anybody else has. Um, I think that's about it, Darren. And anything else you want to say to the listeners before we say bye?
No, just thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure, and it's always fun going around the world and seeing what's happening weather-wise. So I appreciate you having me on and giving me that opportunity.
Of course. We'll look forward to talking to you soon. Thank you so much for listening to the Jacob Shapiro podcast. The show is produced and edited by Jacob Smulian, and it's in many ways the Jacob Show. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, or leave a review. It takes just a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us. Also share with a friend. If you're interested in learning more about hiring me to speak at your event, or if you want to learn more about the wealth management services that I offer through Bespoke or at Cognitive Investments, you can find more information at jacobshapiro.com. You can also write to me directly at jacob@jacobshapiro.com. I'm also on X for now with the handle Jacob Shap. That's Jacob, S-H-A-P, no dats, dashes, or anything else, but I'm not hard to find. See you out there.